What is this, some kind of costume? He held up the old black belt, dangling it above her head like a joke. His friends laughed. 30 people watched. Nobody said a word. Wren Calloway just stood there, 19 years old, mop in one hand, uniform still damp from the floors she'd been cleaning since 10. "Give it back," she said. "Quiet, steady." He dropped it on the tile instead. What Derek Whitfield didn't know, what nobody in that building knew, was the name stitched in faded gold thread along the end of that belt. He didn't know the girl kneeling to pick it up had once stood on a national podium. He didn't know her grandfather built the very program his father was about to shut down. He had 11 days left before he found out. And when he did, every single person in that room found out with him.
The rain started at 9 that night. Just a light rain, the kind that makes a parking lot shine under the streetlights. Wren Calloway pulled her old sedan into the same spot she always used, the one furthest from the door. Fewer people to walk past, fewer eyes. She sat there a moment before turning off the engine, just breathing, just letting the day settle. 19 years old, first year of college, biology major, though some nights she wondered if she'd ever finish it. Tuition doesn't wait for grief, and grief doesn't care what semester it is. Her grandfather had passed 2 years ago. Her grandmother, the woman who raised her, after that passed 8 months back. Wren didn't talk about it much. She didn't need to. The people who mattered already knew. What people didn't know was simpler and stranger. The quiet girl who mopped their floors at night used to stand on a podium with a gold medal around her neck. She once broke boards with her bare hands in front of a packed arena, cheered on by a man who taught her everything he knew about discipline, patience, and restraint. Most nights nobody needed to know that. Most nights that suited her just fine. She grabbed her supply cart from the trunk, the wheels squeaking their usual complaint, and pushed open the side door of Whitfield Martial Arts Academy. The smell hit her first. Sweat rubber mats, a faint trace of liniment. A smell she used to love. Now it mostly just meant work. Inside, the evening class was wrapping up. 30 students in white uniforms bowing to their instructor, then to each other. A row of trophies gleamed behind glass on the far wall. Near the front, laughing louder than anyone else, stood Derek Whitfield Jr., 22 years old, black belt. 3rd degree, if you asked him, though most people around the building quietly doubted the paperwork. He had his father's jaw and none of his father's patience. He filled up a room the moment he walked into it, not because people wanted him to, but because he demanded it. His father owned the academy. Everyone knew that. Derek made certain nobody forgot it. Wren kept her head down and pushed her cart along the back wall toward the closet where she kept her supplies. 4 months of working here had taught her the fastest way through a shift. Don't make eye contact, don't linger, get the floors done, get the mats wiped, get home before midnight if she could manage it. She almost made it to the closet. "Hey, new girl!" She didn't turn around right away. She never did, not at first. "Give it a second. Let your face settle before anyone sees it." Derek's voice carried across the room the way it always did. A few students glanced over, then looked away fast, the way people do when they sense trouble coming and don't want any part of it. "I'm talking to you," Derek said, closer now. "The mop girl." Wren turned. Her expression stayed calm, not cold, not defiant, just calm, like still water. "Evening," she said, "just getting started on the mats." "Good," Derek said, smirking at a couple friends nearby, "because somebody spilled water right where I was about to demonstrate a throw. Real professional work." There was, in fact, a wet patch near the center mat. She hadn't put it there. She hadn't even clocked in yet. She said nothing about that. Arguing never shortened a night, it only lengthened it. "I'll get it," she said, already wheeling her cart forward. "You know," Derek said, following a step behind, loud enough for the whole room, "I looked you up. Community college, first year, biology, right? What's a biology major doing mopping floors at 10 at night?" A few students laughed. Not many. Enough. Wren knelt down, spreading her towel over the wet mat, working it in slow, even strokes. She didn't answer right away. Silence, given time, usually did more work than words. "Paying rent?" she finally said. Same as anyone else? Cute, Derek said. He crouched close enough that she caught his cologne, something sharp and expensive. You know what my dad always says? This academy isn't just a business. It's a family. We take care of our own. He paused, letting that land, then added loud enough for effect. Guess that doesn't include the help. Louder laughter this time. A few students by the water cooler traded glances, uncomfortable, but nobody said a thing. Wren kept wiping. Slow, even strokes. In, out. In, out. You should say something back, Derek said, tilting his head, studying her the way a cat studies something that refuses to run. Most people at least try. Wren looked up at him then, just for a moment. Her eyes were steady, not angry, not scared. I'm not looking for trouble, she said, but I'm not running from it either. Something flickered across his face, surprise maybe. Then he laughed, shook his head, and stood back up to his full height. Sure, he said, walking away. Whatever helps you sleep, mop girl. He rejoined his friends near the front, already telling some exaggerated version of the exchange, laughing at his own joke before he'd even finished it. Wren finished. The mat wrung out her towel and moved to the next section of floor. Near the supply closet, an older man in a faded gray training uniform had watched the whole thing without a word. Walter Grady. 70 years old, though he moved like a man 20 years younger when he needed to. He'd been the head instructor here for over 3 decades, back when Derek's grandfather still ran the place with a patience that seemed to have skipped a generation entirely. Walter said nothing that night. He just watched the young woman kneel to wipe a mat that wasn't her mess, and something about the calm in her shoulders reminded him of someone. He couldn't place who. Not yet. The academy closed at 11 most weeknights. By the time the last student left, Wren was usually alone in the building, save for whoever locked up. Most nights, that was Carol Higgins, another part-time worker, 64 years old, who handled the front desk in the evenings and had worked at Whitfield's for nearly a decade. Carol found Wren in the equipment room that night, coiling extension cords, her face unreadable. You all right, honey? Carol asked, leaning against the doorframe. Wren shrugged, not looking up. I've had worse nights. That was true, more than Carol probably realized. Before this job, Wren had worked 2 part-time positions at once, a grocery store during the day and a call center on weekends just to cover the gap her grandmother's medical bills had left behind. Compared to that, mopping floors for a rude 22-year-old felt almost restful. She'd found the academy job through a flyer on a community bulletin board tucked between a lost cat notice and an ad for piano lessons. Evening cleaning position, flexible hours, the flyer had said. She'd almost skipped over it, some old instinct tightening in her chest at the sight of the crossed swords printed above the academy's name. She'd taken the job anyway. Partly for the paycheck, partly, if she was honest, because some quiet part of her missed the smell of rubber mats and chalk dust even after everything. She hadn't expected Derek. Nobody warns you about the Dereks of the world in a job flyer. Carol sighed the kind of sigh that carries 30 years of watching young men like him grow up entitled and unchecked. That boy's got a mouth on him, always has. His daddy used to be different. Before the money got big and the ego got bigger. It's fine, Wren said. I don't need him to like me, I just need the paycheck. Carol studied her for a moment, the way people study someone they suspect is carrying more than they let on. You ever think about quitting? Carol asked. There's other places that'd take a hard-working girl like you. Diners, retail, somewhere that don't come with a Derek attached. Wren finally looked up and something old moved behind her eyes. My grandfather used to say the people worth becoming don't get to pick easy rooms to stand in. Carol blinked, surprised by the weight of it. Your grandfather sounds like he was a wise man. He was, Wren said, and because that was as far as she ever went on the subject, she zipped up her jacket and reached for her bag. That's when she saw it. Her old canvas bag, the one that had belonged to her grandfather, sat open on the bench near the lockers, not where she'd left it. Not the way she'd left it either. She crossed the room fast and knelt beside it. Someone had gone through it. Her wallet was there, untouched, her keys, her phone charger, an old granola bar wrapper she'd forgotten to throw away, all still there. But something else had been pulled loose. A folded strip of black cloth tucked deep in the bottom lining where she always kept it hidden. Someone had dug it halfway out, then lost interest before finishing the job. Wren's hands went still. She pushed the cloth back down, gently folding it the way she always folded it, careful, precise, like something sacred. Then she zipped the bag shut and held it against her chest for a long moment. "Everything all right?" Carol asked, noticing the shift in her posture. "Fine," Wren said a little too fast. "Just checking my things." She didn't mention the black belt hidden at the bottom of that bag. She never did. Some things, she had decided long ago, stayed folded up and out of sight. The next few days followed the same rhythm, classes during the day, shifts at night, the kind of exhausted routine that only 19-year-olds trying to survive on their own seem able to sustain. Wren kept her head down at the academy, avoided Derek when she could, and endured him when she couldn't. It wasn't cruelty every single night. Sometimes it was just small things, a comment here, a smirk there. The kind of disrespect that builds slowly, like sediment at the bottom of a river, until one day you look down and realize how deep it's gotten. But some nights it was worse. On Thursday, Derek and two friends stayed late practicing sparring drills long after the last class had ended. Wren was mopping near the entrance when Derek called out to her again. "Hey, you ever actually watch us train?" he asked, grinning at his friends. "Might learn something. Might toughen you up a little." "I've got floors to finish," Wren said, not looking up. "Come on," Derek pressed, stepping closer, clearly enjoying his audience of two. "Humor me. Block this." Before she could react, he threw a slow, mocking punch toward her shoulder, nowhere close to full speed, nowhere close to dangerous, but close enough to make his friends laugh, and close enough to make Wren's whole body go still. She stepped back on instinct, her weight shifting onto the balls of her feet, her hands rising slightly before she caught herself and lowered them. Derek stopped mid-laugh. Something in the way she moved caught his attention for half a second. Then it passed just as fast. "Relax," he said, waving a hand. "Wasn't gonna hit you. Not like you'd know what to do if I did." His friends laughed harder. Wren said nothing. She picked her mop back up and kept working, her heart pounding harder than it had any right to over something so small. Across the room near the trophy case, Walter Grady had seen it too. The way her feet moved, the way her hands rose, then dropped like something trained, then deliberately suppressed. He filed it away in the back of his mind, the way old instructors do when a small detail refuses to sit still. He said nothing that night either. But he started watching a little closer. Wren's mornings looked nothing like her nights, and she liked it that way. Biology lecture at 8, a cramped room with fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly all through the professor's slides on cellular respiration. She took notes in small, neat handwriting, the same handwriting her grandmother used to tease her about, saying it looked like it belonged to someone twice her age. Between classes, she studied at a corner table in the library, a thermos of coffee at her elbow, her backpack slung over the chair beside her. Nobody there knew about the academy. Nobody knew about the belt folded at the bottom of her bag, or the medal in a shoebox back at her apartment, or the man who'd taught her to stand the way she stood now, quiet and sure, even in a room full of strangers. She liked that anonymity. It felt some days like the only clean thing left in her life. A place where she was simply a student, tired and underslept, worrying about an exam like anyone else. She thought sometimes about what her professors would say if they knew. Probably nothing much. Probably a raised eyebrow, a passing comment, then back to lecture. That was fine with her. She hadn't built this new life to be noticed in it. She'd built it to survive in it, one semester at a time, one shift at a time, until something eventually felt steady again. She had no way of guessing most mornings. That steadiness was closer than she thought and further away than she hoped, both at the same time. 2 weeks before the Whitfield Invitational, the biggest event on the Academy's calendar, the mood inside the building shifted. Banners went up along the walls. A new trophy case arrived twice the size of the old one, gleaming and empty, waiting to be filled. Robert Whitfield, Derek's father and the academy's owner, walked the halls with the particular energy of a man expecting important guests. This year, the invitational meant more than trophies. It meant funding. For 6 years, the academy had run a program called Open Hands, free self-defense and confidence classes for adults who couldn't otherwise afford lessons. Seniors, single parents, people recovering from illness or injury who wanted their strength back. A handful of local sponsors had funded it, and this year those sponsors were coming to watch the invitational in person, deciding whether to renew their support for another 5 years. Robert cared about the sponsors mostly for what they represented: prestige, reputation, the kind of community goodwill that made for excellent advertising. Whether the program itself survived seemed to anyone paying attention to matter less to him than how it looked on paper. Walter cared for a different reason. Years ago, before Robert owned the building outright, back when the academy still ran on handshake agreements more than sponsorship contracts, a man named Samuel Calloway had pushed for a program that let people without money learn the same discipline and confidence martial arts could offer anyone else. Walter remembered Samuel clearly. His low, warm laugh, the way he used to say that strength without generosity was just another form of cruelty. He remembered, too, that Samuel had a granddaughter he doted on, a small girl who used to sit at the edge of the mats after school, watching her grandfather teach soaking in every lesson, like water into dry ground. Walter hadn't seen that little girl in years, not since Samuel passed. He watched Wren mop the same mats her grandfather once taught on, and a small, uneasy feeling settled into his chest. Not quite recognition. Not yet. Just the sense that something important stood right in front of him, dressed up as something ordinary. On Friday evening, the academy hosted its monthly open house, a chance for prospective students and sponsors to tour the building, watch a demonstration, and mingle over coffee and store-bought cookies. Wren wasn't scheduled to clean until after it ended, but Carol had asked her to come early and help set up chairs along the back wall. She agreed, the way she agreed to most things that came with an extra hour of pay. The room filled slowly. Parents with young children eyeing the mats, a retired schoolteacher who'd always wanted to try Tai Chi, a married couple in their 70s holding hands looking like they'd wandered in out of curiosity more than commitment. Near the front sat a woman in her 60s with short silver hair and a posture like she'd spent decades standing at attention. Ruth Owens, retired police sergeant, 26 years on the force before she hung up her badge. She'd been coming to the academy's evening classes for almost a year, ever since her knees started acting up and her doctor recommended something gentler than her old gym routine. Ruth had a sharp memory honed by decades of watching faces and remembering details that mattered. She sat near the back, sipping bad coffee from a paper cup, watching the room the way she used to watch a precinct full of strangers. Her eyes drifted, almost by accident, toward the young woman setting up folding chairs near the side wall. Something about the girl's posture caught her attention, the way she moved, economical, precise, never a wasted motion. Ruth had seen that kind of movement somewhere before, a long time ago, though she couldn't immediately place where. She watched a little longer, then let it go, chalking it up to an old cop's habit of overanalyzing strangers. The open house rolled forward as planned. Robert gave a short welcome speech, thanking everyone for supporting Open Hands, gesturing toward a poster board covered in photographs of past participants. Derek stood beside him, arms crossed, nodding at the right moments, clearly more interested in the sponsors watching him than in the speech itself. Then came the demonstration. A handful of advanced students, Derek among them, took the mats to show off a few techniques. Throws, strikes, breakfalls, the usual crowd-pleasing sequence designed to impress people who didn't know enough to notice when something got performed a little too hard for a friendly demonstration. Wren watched from the back, arms full of folded chairs, as Derek executed a hard throw against his sparring partner, a younger student who visibly winced on impact. The crowd applauded anyway, unaware of the wince, seeing only speed and confidence. Wren's jaw tightened just slightly. She said nothing. She thought that night of a different room entirely, a smaller one with a concrete floor and a single space heater that never quite kept the winter cold at bay. A grandfather had taught her in that garage for 3 years before he ever let her set foot in a real dojo. No trophies on the walls, no sponsors watching, just the two of them, an old boombox playing static-laced radio, and a set of hand-drawn diagrams taped up beside the door. Anyone can throw a punch when they're angry, he used to tell her, guiding her wrist back into position for the 100th time that week. Takes real discipline to throw one when you're calm. That's the only kind worth teaching. She remembered the blisters on her palms that first year, the ache in her shoulders after every session, the frustration of failing the same simple block over and over until her body finally understood it without her mind having to ask. She remembered, too, the first time she landed it clean. Her grandfather hadn't cheered, hadn't clapped. He'd simply nodded once, slow and certain, the kind of approval that meant more to her than any trophy ever would. "Good," he'd said. "Now do it again. Discipline isn't a moment, it's a habit." She carried that habit with her still, 4 months into a job that asked nothing of her but a mop and a quiet mouth. Every slow, even stroke across a dirty mat. Every calm breath while Derek's voice rattled off another cruelty. Every night she chose patience over the satisfaction of proving him wrong. She wondered sometimes if he would recognize the habit in her now buried under a uniform that had nothing to do with martial arts at all. She liked to think he would. After the open house ended and the last guests filtered out, the real work began. Chairs folded and stacked, floors mopped, trash bins emptied. Derek lingered near the front desk with 2 friends, waiting for his father to finish a conversation with the sponsor before they all headed out for a late dinner to celebrate what Robert considered a successful evening. Wren wheeled her cart past them, eyes forward, focused on the storage closet at the far end of the hall. "Hey!" Derek called out, his voice carrying that same easy cruelty. "You missed a spot!" Wren stopped, glancing back. There was, in fact, a small puddle of spilled punch near where the refreshment table had been. "I'll get it," she said simply, turning her cart around. "Wait," Derek said, stepping in front of her path, blocking it just enough to be an obstacle rather than a wall. "Before you go clean up my mess, humor me for a second." His friends chuckled behind him, already anticipating whatever came next. "I've been thinking," Derek continued, crossing his arms. "You're here every single night, mopping floors, wiping mats, watching us train. You ever wonder what it'd feel like to actually be good at something?" Wren said nothing. Silence usually ended these conversations faster than words did. But Derek wasn't finished. He reached for the strap of her canvas bag slung over the handle of her cleaning cart and tugged it free before she could stop him. "What's even in here?" he asked, half joking, half genuinely curious, the curiosity of someone who has never once had to think about consequences. "Give it back," Wren said, her voice flat but firm. "Relax," Derek said, already unzipping it. "Just looking." He turned it upside down over the front desk counter, and the contents spilled out in a small, undignified pile. Her wallet, her keys, a half-empty water bottle, a worn paperback with a cracked spine, and tumbling out last, a folded strip of black fabric that landed softly on the counter, unfurling slightly at one end. Derek picked it up, turning it over, and for a brief moment something in his expression flickered with curiosity. It was a belt, old, clearly well-worn, the fabric softened by years of use. Along one end, faded gold thread spelled out a name in careful hand-stitched letters. Calloway. Derek squinted at it, then laughed, sharp and dismissive. "What is this, some kind of costume?" he asked, holding it up for his friends. "You into cosplay or something, mop girl?" His friends laughed along, though a few traded uncertain glances, sensing something off, but not understanding what. Wren's face had gone very still. She stepped forward and reached for the belt, her voice quieter now, but tighter. "Give it back." Derek pulled it just out of reach, grinning, enjoying the first real crack he'd found in weeks of trying. "Relax," he said again. "It's just an old belt. Probably picked it up at a thrift store." "Give it back," Wren repeated, and this time something underneath the words made one of his friends stop laughing entirely. Derek noticed it too. For a split second, his grin faltered. Then, because he was the kind of young man who had never once backed down in front of an audience, he tossed the belt carelessly onto the counter, letting it slide off the edge and drop to the floor. "There," he said, happy. Wren knelt immediately, gathering the belt off the tile with both hands, holding it against her chest, the way someone holds something they've nearly lost. She said nothing else. She gathered the rest of her scattered things into her bag, zipped it shut, and walked toward the supply closet without another word. Behind her, Derek shrugged at his friends, already moving to some other topic, already forgetting the moment entirely. But near the trophy case, Walter Grady had watched the whole exchange in silence, his old eyes narrowing at the sight of that faded gold name stitched into worn black fabric. Calloway. He knew that name. He had heard it spoken with respect for over 30 years. He'd seen it once before, stitched into a very similar belt worn by a broad-shouldered man with a low, warm laugh, a man who used to say that strength without generosity was just another form of cruelty. Walter set down the folding chair he'd been holding. For the first time in a long while, something clicked quietly into place. He said nothing that night. He simply watched the young woman disappear into the closet, carrying her grandfather's belt against her chest like something sacred. Then he made a decision. Tomorrow, he'd find out exactly who Wren Calloway really was. Later that night, after the building emptied and the parking lot lights buzzed alone over wet asphalt, Wren sat in her car a long moment before starting the engine. The belt lay across her lap, still slightly damp from where it had touched the floor. She ran her thumb along the stitched letters, feeling the small ridges of thread beneath her fingertips, worn smooth from years of handling. "I'm sorry," she whispered, to no one in particular, or maybe to someone who could no longer hear her. "I know you'd tell me to let it go." She folded the belt carefully and tucked it back into the bottom of her bag beneath the wallet and the water bottle and the granola bar wrapper she kept forgetting to throw away. Then she started the car and drove home through the thinning rain. Walter didn't sleep well that night. He lay awake in his small house on the edge of town, staring at the ceiling fan, turning slow circles above his bed, letting his mind travel back further than it had in years. He thought of Samuel Calloway, the way the man used to arrive an hour early to every class just to sweep the mats himself. Samuel always said a clean floor was the first lesson he ever taught anyone. He thought of the two of them on the front steps of the old building, long since torn down and rebuilt, drinking coffee from paper cups, arguing gently about whether patience could be taught or whether some people were simply born with more of it. Samuel believed it could be taught. He'd spent his whole life trying to prove it. Walter remembered the tournament too, the one that changed everything, a regional championship over a decade back. A 15-year-old girl, hair pulled into a tight braid, stepping onto the mat and moving like something out of a dream. Calm, precise, never a wasted motion. He remembered Samuel at the edge of that mat, not shouting instructions like the other coaches, just watching, arms crossed, a quiet, proud smile the whole time. Walter hadn't thought about that girl in years. Some memories settle at the bottom of a person's mind, waiting for the right moment to rise back up. Tonight, watching Derek toss a faded black belt onto a countertop, that memory rose all at once. He got up before sunrise, made a pot of coffee, and pulled an old cardboard box down from his closet shelf. Photographs, small trophies, newspaper clippings gone yellow at the edges. It took nearly an hour to find it. A clipping from a regional paper, print faded but legible, a photograph of a young girl mid-stance, fierce and focused. A headline above her read, "Local teen takes national junior title." Walter held the clipping under the kitchen light for a long time. Faces change. People grow. But something in the set of the jaw, something in those calm, steady eyes matched exactly what he'd seen the night before. A young woman kneeling on the floor, gathering a scattered belt back into a canvas bag. You didn't tell anyone that day. Some things need watching a little longer before they get spoken out loud. The following week brought a new class to the evening schedule. Robert had expanded Open Hands to include gentle self-defense classes for older adults, mostly women in their 60s and 70s looking to build back a little confidence, a little balance, a little quiet strength the world had slowly stopped offering them. Walter taught it himself twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday evenings. It was by far his favorite hour of the whole schedule. Eleanor Post, 68 years old, had been coming for nearly 3 months. Her friends called her Ellie. She'd lost her husband 4 years back, after 39 years of marriage, and had spent the years since learning how to live alone in a house built for 2. Her daughter had pushed her toward the class, worried about her mother living by herself, worried about the kind of vulnerability that settles into a person's bones after enough years of being told, gently or otherwise, that they're growing too old to matter. Ellie liked the class more than she expected to. She liked Walter's patient, unhurried way of teaching. And she liked more than anything the quiet young woman who sometimes lingered near the doorway after finishing her cleaning early, watching the seniors practice their stances with an expression Ellie could only call tender. "You've got a good eye," Ellie told her one evening, catching her watching from the door. "Ever think about teaching?" Wren smiled. A small, real smile, the kind Carol would have noticed instantly. "Maybe someday." "Don't wait too long," Ellie said, straightening her posture the way Walter had shown her. "Life's got a funny way of deciding things for you if you wait around too long to decide them yourself." The accident happened on a Thursday evening, 11 days before the Whitfield Invitational. Ellie's class had just finished a set of balance drills near the far wall, close to a tall shelving unit where the academy stored extra mats, spare pads, and a row of heavy metal weight plates left over from an earlier conditioning class. Nobody noticed that a mounting bracket on the top shelf had come loose that afternoon, jostled during an equipment delivery. Nobody noticed the shelf leaning just slightly under the weight stacked near its edge. Nobody noticed until it was already falling. Ellie stood right beneath it, chatting with another student, laughing at something Walter had said moments before. Completely unaware. Wren was sweeping near the front desk 20 feet away. She caught the motion out of the corner of her eye, a flicker, a shift in the shadow along the wall. She didn't think. She just moved. Later, nobody could quite agree on the details. Some said she crossed the room in half a second. Others swore she seemed to glide rather than run. What everyone agreed on was this. By the time the shelf tipped and the plates came crashing down, Wren had already reached Ellie, one arm wrapped firm but gentle around her shoulders, pulling her backward out of the falling shelf's path in one clean motion. The plates hit the mat with a heavy metallic crash, bounced once, and settled in a cloud of rubber dust. For a moment, the whole room went silent. Ellie stood frozen in Wren's arms, staring at the spot where she'd been standing a second before. A few inches closer. A half-second slower. Those plates would have landed right on her. "Are you all right?" Wren asked, her own hands trembling slightly now with adrenaline. "I think so," Ellie said, catching her breath. "My goodness, what just happened?" Walter pushed through the small crowd with more speed than his 70 years usually allowed. "Ellie, are you hurt? Can you feel your legs all right?" "I'm fine, Walter," Ellie said, managing a small laugh. "Thanks to this young woman, apparently." Walter looked up at Wren then, really looked at her in a way he hadn't let himself before. She'd already settled back into her usual quiet shape, as if that burst of fierce, precise motion had folded itself away again, tucked into whatever hidden place she kept things like that. But Walter had seen it. The way she crossed the room, the way her feet planted low and balanced exactly where they needed to be, the way her arm wrapped around Ellie with just enough pressure to move her fast and not 1 ounce more than that. That wasn't instinct built from nothing. That was instinct built from years of training, drilled so deep into muscle memory it surfaced even when the person carrying it had spent years trying to bury it. "Wren," Walter said once the maintenance crew had been called to secure the shelving. "Can I speak with you a moment, just the two of us?" She hesitated, sensing something had shifted, though she couldn't yet name what. "Sure. Let me finish sweeping this dust first." "It can wait," Walter said gently, but with a firmness that surprised her. "This can't." He led her to the small office at the back of the building, the one that had belonged to the Academy's founding instructors long before Robert's name went up on the sign out front. He closed the door softly, reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He handed it to her without a word. Wren unfolded it slowly and her breath caught. The newspaper clipping. Faded, yellowed, unmistakable. A photograph of a 15-year-old girl mid-stance, fierce and focused, her own face staring back at her from over a decade ago. "I've been in this business a long time," Walter said, watching her carefully. "Long enough to recognize good instincts when I see them, and long enough to recognize a name stitched into an old belt even after all these years." Wren's hands trembled slightly around the clipping. "I knew your grandfather," Walter said, his voice softening further. "Samuel Calloway was one of the finest men I ever had the privilege of calling a friend. This academy exists in no small part because of what he built here, what he believed in." Wren said nothing for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Please don't tell anyone." Walter studied the plea in her eyes, the exhaustion underneath it, the kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy alone for far too long. "Can I ask why?" he said. "Why hide something like this? Why let a boy like Derek treat you the way he does when you could put him on his back in about 4 seconds flat?" Wren looked down at the clipping again, thumb brushing the edge of the faded photograph. "Because the last time I let that part of myself out," she said, "someone got hurt, really hurt. And I promised myself I'd never let my hands decide anything again, not unless I truly had no other choice." Walter didn't press further. He simply nodded, folded the clipping, and handed it back for her to keep. "All right," he said, "your secret's safe with me. For now. But I want you to understand something, Wren. Whatever happened in your past, whatever promise you made yourself, there may come a day soon when having no other choice finds you anyway. And when that day comes, I don't believe your grandfather would want you standing there with your hands hidden behind your back." Wren tucked the clipping carefully into her bag next to the folded black belt at the bottom and thanked him softly before heading back out to finish sweeping the floor. Walking back into that room full of settling dust and shaken students, she felt lighter than she had in weeks, and heavier, too, both at once. 11 days stood between her and the invitational. She had no reason yet to think that number would ever matter to her at all. Ruth Owens had watched the whole thing from across the room, coffee cup halfway to her lips, forgotten. 26 years on the force teaches a person to notice things, small things. The way a person's weight shifts before they move, the way a hand rises before the brain even decides to raise it. Ruth had spent a career reading rooms full of strangers, and some habits never really retire even after the badge gets turned in. She'd seen that same economy of motion once before, a long time ago, on a television screen, in a bar, 2 towns over, watching a regional championship with off-duty co-workers who dragged her along for the drinks, not the sport. She remembered it because of how quiet the crowd had gone during one particular final match. A young girl, calm as still water, taking apart an opponent twice her size without a single wasted movement. Ruth hadn't thought about that memory in years. Tonight it came back whole, unbidden, the way old memories sometimes do when triggered by something the conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. She didn't say anything to Wren that night. She simply watched her finish sweeping the dust from the floor, watched the calm settle back over her shoulders like a coat she knew exactly how to wear. And Ruth found herself thinking the same thought she used to think back on the force whenever a case didn't add up the way it should. Something here doesn't match the story on the surface. She made a note to herself to keep watching. Old instincts, much like old training, rarely fully retire. Wren didn't sleep well either that night, though, for entirely different reasons than Walter. She lay in her small apartment, the one she'd moved into after her grandmother passed, staring at the same water stain on the ceiling she'd been meaning to ask her landlord about for months. Her grandfather's belt sat folded on the nightstand beside her, next to the clipping Walter had handed back. She thought about the tournament, the one from the photograph, though she rarely let herself think about it anymore. The roar of that crowd, The weight of the gold medal, her grandfather's face afterward, proud in a way that made her chest ache even now. And she thought about the other memory, the one she kept locked away, tighter than any of the others. A different match, a year after that championship, when a moment of overconfidence and a fraction of a second's bad judgment had sent an opponent to the hospital with an injury that took 8 months to heal. Nobody had blamed her, not officially. The referees called it a clean, if unfortunate, competition injury, but she'd seen the other girl's face afterward, pale and frightened on a stretcher, and something inside her had closed a door that never fully opened again. Her grandfather had tried gently for years to coax her back onto the mats. He never pushed. He simply left the door open, the way patient people do, trusting that someone would walk back through it when they were ready. She never got the chance to tell him she might have been getting close. He passed before she found her way back. Now there was only Wren, the quiet ache of a promise made in a hospital waiting room years ago, and a belt folded neatly at the bottom of a canvas bag, waiting for a day she wasn't sure would ever actually come. Some doors once propped open by an old man sweeping mats before sunrise, or a woman surviving alone in a house built for two, or a retired officer who still notices things out of habit, have a way of swinging wider than anyone standing nearby expects. Wren finally drifted off sometime after midnight, her hand resting on the folded belt beside her. 3 separate people now carried a piece of her secret, though none of them had spoken to each other about it yet. Tomorrow would bring more of the same. The mop, the mats, Derek's voice, sharp and careless, echoing across a room that had no idea what it was truly looking at. She thought, drifting off of her grandfather's voice again. Discipline isn't a moment, it's a habit. She'd spent 4 months proving that to herself, one quiet shift at a time, long before anyone else in that building had the faintest idea she was proving anything at all. Outside her window, the rain had finally eased into a soft, steady drizzle, the kind that made the whole town sound like it was holding its breath. Somewhere across the city, an old man slept with a faded clipping resting on his nightstand. Somewhere else, a retired officer lay awake a while longer than usual, turning an old memory over in her mind like a coin she couldn't quite place. None of them knew yet how soon their separate threads would pull tight around the same quiet, unassuming young woman. But threads like that rarely stay separate for long. Not once they've all been tugged even gently in the same direction. Somewhere in that small apartment, a young woman slept soundly for the first time in days, unaware that the quiet life she had built so carefully around herself was about to become something else entirely. The days after the shelf accident moved differently than the days before it. Wren still showed up every evening with her cart and her mop and her practiced way of making herself invisible. But something underneath the surface had shifted. The way a house feels different once you learn there's a hidden room behind one of the walls, even if nobody ever opens the door. Walter watched her a little longer now, before turning back to his own work. Ellie greeted her a little warmer, lingering a beat past what politeness required, and Ruth Owens, who had said nothing to anyone, simply kept noticing the way trained eyes do, waiting to see what the noticing would eventually add up to. Wren didn't know about Ruth's suspicions yet. She only knew about Walter, and even that felt like more weight than she wanted carried by another person. She'd asked him, the morning after the accident, to keep her secret. He'd promised her he would, for now. But promises like that carry their own weight, and Walter Grady was not a man who enjoyed the taste of a secret sitting heavy in his chest. He said nothing further to anyone. He simply watched and waited and let the days pass the way an old man learns to patient as weather. The Whitfield Invitational was 9 days out now, and the pressure inside the building had climbed steadily with each passing afternoon. Robert Whitfield had taken to walking the halls with a clipboard, checking off preparations, with the anxious energy of a man who understood on some level that this tournament mattered for reasons well beyond trophies. The sponsors were arriving within the week. Their decision about renewing Open Hands funding would come shortly after. Robert cared about that funding, though not always for reasons that would have made a founder like Samuel Calloway proud. To Robert, Open Hands had become a line item on a grant proposal, a photograph in a brochure, Proof of community goodwill that made the academy look generous without costing very much at all. Whether the actual people in the actual program benefited seemed to anyone paying close attention a secondary concern at best. Derek felt the pressure too, in his own particular way. He wanted the sponsors watching him specifically. He wanted his father's approval, the kind that came loud and public, the kind that had always seemed to slip just out of reach no matter how many belts he collected or trophies he won. He'd been sparring harder than usual all week, pushing his training partners past comfortable limits, snapping at anyone who couldn't keep pace with him. A few of the younger students had started avoiding partnering with him at all, which only seemed to sharpen his frustration further. And underneath all of it, though, he never would have admitted it out loud, something about the shelving accident had bothered him more than he expected.
He'd been in the room that evening. He hadn't moved. He hadn't even noticed the shelf tipping until the crash already happened, until it was the cleaning girl of all people who'd handled the whole situation faster than he could process what he was even looking at. It nagged at him in a way he didn't have words for, the way small humiliations sometimes burrowed deeper than the large ones. Over the following days, he found himself watching Wren with a new kind of attention, one edged with something closer to resentment than curiosity. He didn't like not understanding something, and he liked even less the idea that a girl he'd spent months dismissing might understand something he didn't. 2 nights before the walkthrough, Derek stayed after closing, running through his demonstration sequence alone on the empty mat, the overhead lights buzzing faintly above him. He'd run the routine a dozen times that week already, each pass sharper than the last, each pass a little more convinced that tonight was the night everything finally lined up the way it was supposed to. His father watching from the front row, the sponsors nodding along, the kind of moment he'd been chasing since he was old enough to tie his own belt. He thought briefly of the cleaning girl and her strange, silent competence, the way she'd crossed the room during the accident faster than he could blink. He shook the thought off almost as quickly as it arrived. Whatever that had been, it had nothing to do with him. He had a demonstration to perfect, sponsors to impress, a father to finally satisfy. He didn't consider not once that night that a woman 3 months into her first martial arts class might not move the way his practice partners moved. He didn't consider much of anything beyond how good the sequence would look, how impressed the room would be, how long it had been since his father looked at him the way he used to look at trophies lined up behind glass. He locked up a little after midnight, satisfied with the routine, already imagining the applause. Robert met with the Harpers for coffee the morning of the walkthrough, going over the evening's schedule, detail by detail, eager to leave nothing to chance. "We're genuinely looking forward to seeing the program in person," Mrs. Harper said, stirring cream into her cup. "We've read the reports for years. It's different seeing something with your own eyes." "You'll be impressed," Robert said with the particular confidence of a man who has never once doubted his own presentation. "Derek's put together something special for tonight, a real showcase of what open hands makes possible." Mr. Harper nodded, glancing briefly at his wife. "We do want to make sure the funding keeps serving the people it's meant for, not just the ones who photograph well for a brochure." Robert laughed a touch too quickly. Of course. He didn't dwell on the comment much longer than that. He had a building to prepare, a son to trust, and an evening to get through before he could finally relax into whatever the sponsors decided. He had no reason that morning to imagine how differently the evening would actually unfold. The days leading up to the sponsor walkthrough brought a steady drip of small frictions between Derek and Wren, the kind that rarely rise to the level of a real confrontation but wear on a person all the same. He started leaving his gear scattered near her cleaning cart on purpose, forcing her to work around it. He made a habit of walking past her while she mopped, commenting loudly to whichever friend happened to be nearby about how some people just weren't cut out for anything more demanding than pushing a bucket around. Wren absorbed all of it the way she absorbed most things now, with a kind of practiced patience that had less to do with weakness and more to do with a promise she'd made herself years ago. She kept her head down. She kept working. She told herself most nights that a few more months of this and she'd have saved enough to cut her hours here and pick up something closer to campus instead.
She didn't let Derek see that his comments landed anywhere at all. She'd learned a long time ago that boys like him fed on visible reactions the way a fire feeds on dry wood, and the fastest way to starve a fire like that was to simply refuse it any air. But Carol noticed. Carol always noticed. "You know," Carol said one evening, watching Derek saunter past with yet another dismissive remark trailing behind him, "in 30-some years of working around young men like that, I've never once seen it end well for them. Something always catches up, eventually." "Maybe," Wren said, wringing out her mop with a little more force than the task strictly required. "Not maybe," Carol said firmly. "Always. I've watched it happen more times than I can count. Boys like Derek build their whole selves out of other people's silence. The day that silence runs out, there's nothing underneath holding them up." Wren managed a small, tired smile at that, though she wasn't sure most nights that she believed it applied to her own situation. Some days it felt like the silence might simply go on forever, an endless tax paid for the privilege of a steady paycheck. She had no way of guessing how soon and how completely Carol's words were about to prove true. Ellie's class continued twice a week, unaffected by the accident, beyond a properly bolted shelf and a slightly more cautious eye toward the corner of the room where it had happened. She'd taken to arriving a few minutes early most days, in part because she enjoyed the quiet stretch of time before the room filled up, and in part because those few minutes usually meant a chance to talk with Wren before her shift properly began. "You ever going to tell me your secret?" Ellie asked one Tuesday evening, only half joking, watching Wren wipe down the front counter. Wren glanced up, startled. "What secret?" "The one that let you cross this whole room faster than my grandson runs the mile," Ellie said, arching an eyebrow. "I may be old, dear, but I'm not blind. Nobody moves like that without some kind of history behind it." Wren managed a small smile. "Maybe I just got lucky." "Maybe," Ellie said, clearly unconvinced but kind enough not to push. "Whatever it is, I'm grateful for it. My daughter's still shaking every time I tell the story. She wants to send you a fruit basket." Wren laughed, a real laugh this time, brief but genuine. "That's not necessary." "Humor an old woman," Ellie said. "Let somebody thank you properly for once." It was such a small exchange, barely worth noticing on its own, but Wren carried it with her the rest of the night, turning it over while she pushed her cart down empty hallways. She wasn't used to people looking at her and seeing more than a cleaning girl. She wasn't sure most days that she wanted them to. But some small, buried part of her had started very slowly to lean toward the warmth of being truly seen. That night driving home, long after her shift ended, Wren found herself thinking about her grandmother, something she tried not to do too often, because the missing still came sharp and sudden when she let it in. Her grandmother had raised her the 2 years after her grandfather passed, moving into the same small house Wren had grown up visiting on weekends, filling the quiet rooms with the smell of coffee and the sound of an old radio tuned permanently to a station that played nothing but decades-old standards. She'd been a practical woman, her grandmother. Not given much to sentiment out loud, though her actions had always said more than her words ever needed to. She'd sat with Wren every night for a month after the injury that ended her competitive career, saying almost nothing, just being present, letting her granddaughter grieve it out in stages, instead of forcing her to explain herself all at once. "You don't owe the world an explanation for protecting your own heart," her grandmother had told her once, stirring a pot of soup on the stove, not even looking up from the task. "Not everybody needs to understand why you stepped back. Some things are between you and you." Wren had held on to that for years. But sitting in her car that night thinking about Ellie's small act of thanks, about Walter's steady patience, about the way this strange borrowed community at the academy had slowly stopped feeling like a job and started feeling like something else entirely, Wren wondered, for the first time in a long while, whether her grandmother might have also said something else had she lived long enough to see how far that silence had stretched. Something about not letting the fear of one bad day steal every good day that could still follow it. She never got the chance to ask her directly. Her grandmother had passed quickly, a heart that simply gave out one ordinary Tuesday morning, no warning, no long goodbye. Just a regular day that ended differently than every regular day before it. Wren had learned in the aftermath of that loss that grief doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it just rides along in the passenger seat of your car through every rain-soaked drive home, waiting patiently for you to notice it's still there. She wiped her eyes, started the engine, and drove the rest of the way home in silence. 6 days remained before the invitational. She had no reason yet to expect what those 6 days would cost her. The trouble started, as it so often does, with something small enough to seem forgettable in the moment. 6 days before the invitational, Robert Whitfield scheduled a walkthrough for 2 of the Academy's largest sponsors, a pair of local business owners who had funded Open Hands for the past 4 years and were considering doubling their commitment if the tournament went well. He wanted the building at its absolute best, every mat aligned, every trophy polished, every student on best behavior performing their best techniques for an audience that mattered more than most of them fully understood. Derek saw the walkthrough as his opportunity. He'd asked his father days earlier whether he could lead part of the demonstration for the sponsors himself, showcasing some of the more advanced open-hand students, alongside the Academy's competitive team, proof that the program produced real visible results. Robert had agreed easily enough, distracted by a dozen other preparations without considering too closely what that demonstration might actually look like in practice. Derek decided, without asking anyone, that Ellie Post would be part of it. She was, in his mind, the perfect example, an older woman who'd built real confidence and skill through the program, someone the sponsors could watch and immediately understand the value of what their money supported. He didn't consult Walter about it, and didn't consider whether Ellie herself felt ready for anything beyond the gentle pace her class usually kept. He simply informed her the evening before the walkthrough that she'd be demonstrating a basic defensive sequence alongside him in front of the sponsors. Nothing complicated, he told her, flashing the easy charm he saved for people whose opinions of him mattered. Just a simple block and release. You'll be great. Ellie, flattered and a little nervous, agreed. She trusted the Academy. She trusted, as it turned out too easily, that someone teaching a technique to a 68-year-old woman in front of an audience would remember to teach it gently. The walkthrough began well enough. The sponsors arrived a little before 6. A well-dressed couple named the Harpers, greeted warmly by Robert at the front door, offered coffee and a tour of the newly renovated space. Robert walked them through the building with practiced ease, gesturing toward the trophy case, the updated equipment, the framed photographs of past Open Hands graduates lining the hallway. Derek waited near the main mat, dressed in his crispest uniform, aware of exactly how good he looked standing there. When the group reached the central training area, Robert gestured proudly toward his son. "Derek's going to walk you through a few of our techniques, if that's all right. He's one of our finest instructors, and he's been working closely with several of our Open Hands participants." The Harpers smiled politely, settling onto a nearby bench to watch. Ellie stepped onto the mat a moment later, a little nervous but composed, offering the sponsors a small friendly wave before turning her attention to Derek. "Ready?" he asked, loud enough for the small audience to hear his tone, warm and encouraging in a way that felt to anyone watching closely slightly performed. "Ready," Ellie said, settling into the stance Walter had drilled into her over the past 3 months. The first sequence went smoothly. Derek threw a slow, telegraphed strike, and Ellie blocked it exactly as she'd practiced, the small crowd offering a light round of applause. Robert beamed. The Harpers nodded approvingly, clearly impressed by the visible confidence in the older woman's movements. Derek, riding the swell of attention, decided to push further than planned. "Let's show them something a little more advanced," he said, loud enough for his father to hear, quiet enough that Ellie barely had time to process the shift before he moved. He grabbed her wrist faster and firmer than anything they'd practiced, initiating a release technique she'd only been shown once, briefly, weeks earlier, and never fully drilled. Ellie panicked, just slightly, her feet shifting the wrong direction as she tried to remember a technique her body hadn't yet learned to trust. Derek, either not noticing her hesitation or simply not caring, pushed forward with the same forceful momentum he used with his competitive sparring partners, expecting her to move with him the way a trained athlete would. She didn't. She stumbled instead, her back foot catching awkwardly against the edge of the mat, her balance gone entirely before she even understood what was happening. She fell hard, her hip taking the brunt of the impact against the mat's edge, where the padding thinned near the wall. The sound she made wasn't loud. That was somehow the worst part of it. Just a short, sharp gasp, followed by a low, pained groan as she curled instinctively around her side. For a moment, the entire room froze. "Ellie?" Walter's voice cut through the silence first, and he was moving before anyone else in the room had fully registered what had happened. He knelt beside her, hands steady despite the alarm in his eyes, checking her carefully, the way decades of training had taught him to. "Don't move yet. Just breathe. Tell me where it hurts." "My hip," Ellie managed, her face pale, tears gathering more from shock than pain, though the pain was clearly considerable. "I think something's wrong. I heard something." Robert rushed forward next, his earlier pride evaporating instantly into panic, his eyes darting toward the Harpers who had both risen from the bench, their expressions shifting from polite interest to genuine concern. "Someone call an ambulance," Walter said sharply, his voice carrying an authority that silenced any hesitation in the room. Derek stood a few feet away, frozen, his face pale, the easy confidence from moments earlier completely drained out of him. "I didn't mean," he started, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Watching Walter carefully lift Ellie's leg just slightly to check for obvious deformity, the ambulance arrived 12 minutes later. 12 of the longest minutes most people in that room had ever experienced, filled with Ellie's shallow, controlled breathing, Walter's steady reassurances, and the Harpers standing near the door, watching everything unfold with the particular stillness of people quietly reconsidering a decision. As the paramedics carefully loaded Ellie onto a stretcher, she reached out and caught Walter's sleeve. "Tell Wren I'm sorry I can't finish the drills we practiced," she said, attempting a small, brave smile despite the pain clearly written across her face. "Tell her I'll be back." Walter squeezed her hand gently. "I'll tell her. You just focus on getting better." The ambulance doors closed, the sirens faded down the street, and the room settled into a heavy, uncertain silence, the kind that follows any moment when something ordinary suddenly reveals how fragile it always was. Robert turned to his son the moment the ambulance pulled away, his voice low and tight with barely contained panic. "What happened out there? That was not the technique we discussed." "I don't know," Derek said, his voice unsteady in a way that rarely showed itself in public. I don't know, she moved wrong. I barely touched her." The Harpers exchanged a quiet glance near the doorway, clearly unconvinced, clearly recalculating whatever assumptions had brought them there in the first place. Robert noticed the glance. Robert noticed everything when his reputation was on the line. He needed urgently a way to reframe what had just happened, something that shifted the story away from his son's judgment, away from a technique performed too roughly on a 68-year-old woman in front of the very sponsors whose funding decision hung in the balance. His eyes drifted almost involuntarily toward the edge of the mat where Ellie had fallen, toward the thin, worn padding along the wall, toward the faint, barely visible scuff mark where her foot had caught. An idea began forming, ugly and convenient all at once. "Was this section of the mat cleaned properly today?" Robert asked, his voice carrying just enough volume to reach the Harpers without seeming to address them directly. Derek caught the shift in his father's tone immediately, the way a drowning man catches sight of anything floating nearby. "I don't know. I mean, maybe not. The floor felt a little slick when I was setting up." It wasn't true. Neither of them had any real reason to believe it was true, but it was conveniently an answer that moved the entire weight of the accident onto someone who wasn't currently standing in the room to defend herself. Wren arrived for her shift 20 minutes later, entirely unaware of what had happened her cart squeaking its familiar complaint down the front hallway. She noticed immediately that something felt wrong. The unusual stillness in the building, the tight, anxious energy radiating from Robert, who stood near the front desk with his arms crossed, his expression hard in a way she hadn't seen from him before. "Wren," he said, his voice clipped. "A word, please." She set her card aside, an uneasy feeling settling low in her stomach. "Is everything all right?" "There was an accident this evening," Robert said, choosing his words with visible care. "Eleanor Post fell during a demonstration. She's been taken to the hospital." Wren's face drained of color instantly.
"Is she all right? What happened?" "She caught her foot on a section of the mat that appears not to have been cleaned properly," Robert said, watching her reaction closely as he spoke. "There was residue near the padding, a slick spot right where she fell." Wren stared at him, confusion giving way slowly to something colder as the implications settled into place. "I clean that mat every single night. I cleaned it this morning before my shift ended." "Apparently not thoroughly enough," Robert said, his tone hardening now, the earlier hesitation gone entirely. "The woman is in the hospital, Wren. On the same evening, 2 of our largest sponsors were touring this facility. Do you understand the position that puts me in?" "I understand a woman got hurt," Wren said, her voice trembling slightly now, though whether from fear or anger even, she couldn't fully tell. "But I did not leave that floor unclean. I would never." Derek stood a few feet away near the edge of the room, saying nothing, his eyes fixed carefully on some point on the far wall, refusing to meet Wren's gaze. Wren looked at him directly, something sharp rising in her chest for the first time in months. "Derek, you were there. Tell your father what actually happened." For a long moment, Derek said nothing at all. Then, without looking up, he said, "The floor did feel slick when I was setting up." The lie landed heavier than anything he'd ever said to her before, heavier even than the cruelest jokes, because this one carried real consequences behind it.
"That's not true,"
Wren said, her voice rising now, the calm control she'd maintained for months finally beginning to crack under the weight of the injustice unfolding in front of her. "I did my job. I always do my job." Robert held up a hand, his patience visibly thinning. "I don't have time to investigate this thoroughly tonight. I have sponsors reconsidering a 5-year funding commitment because a woman got seriously injured in my facility. I need to show them immediately that I take this seriously and that I'm addressing it." "Firing me isn't addressing it," Wren said. "It's covering it up." Robert's expression hardened further. "I think it's best if you collect your things and leave. Effective immediately. I'll mail your final paycheck." The words landed like a physical blow. Wren stood frozen for a moment. The injustice of it, so complete, so absurd that part of her almost expected someone to step in and correct the record. She looked toward Walter's office, hoping he might appear, hoping his knowledge of her past, his understanding of who her grandfather had been, might somehow tip the scales back toward fairness. But Walter had gone with the ambulance to make sure Ellie wasn't alone at the hospital, trusting reasonably that nothing this unjust could happen in the short window before he returned. Wren looked back at Robert, then at Derek, who still refused to meet her eyes. "You know this isn't true," she said directly to Derek. "You know exactly what happened out there." Derek's jaw tightened. For one brief moment, something like guilt flickered across his face. Then it passed, replaced by the same practiced indifference he wore like armor whenever things threatened to become genuinely uncomfortable. "Just go, Wren. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." She gathered her things in silence, her hands trembling as she zipped her canvas bag shut, the same bag her grandfather had carried decades earlier, the same bag that held a belt and a newspaper clipping that proved beyond any argument exactly who she really was. She thought for one brief, exhausted moment about pulling that belt out right there in front of everyone, about telling Robert exactly whose granddaughter he was firing, exactly what legacy he was carelessly discarding along with her. But something held her back. Pride, maybe, or exhaustion, or the certainty that the truth shouldn't have to be leveraged like a weapon just to be believed. She wanted to be trusted, because she'd earned it, not because of a name stitched into old fabric. So she said nothing about the belt. She simply zipped her bag, slung it over her shoulder, and walked toward the front door without looking back. The rain had started again outside, soaking through her jacket within moments of stepping into it. She reached her car, fumbling slightly with her keys, her hands still unsteady from the shock of everything that had just happened. As she pulled her bag off her shoulder to set it on the passenger seat, the strap caught awkwardly on the door handle, and the old, worn seam along the bottom finally gave way after years of wear. The bag tore open, spilling its contents across the wet pavement. her wallet, her keys already in her hand. A paperback novel, its pages fanning open against the rain, and sliding out last, the folded black belt unfurling slightly as it landed in a shallow puddle forming near the curb. Wren knelt down in the rain, gathering everything with hands that had gone numb, whether from cold or from something deeper she couldn't quite tell. She held the belt against her chest, rain soaking into the fabric, blurring the careful gold stitching of her grandfather's name. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the belt, to her grandfather, to the version of herself that had once stood proud on a podium believing the world was fair to people who worked hard and told the truth. "I tried." She stayed there a long moment, kneeling on wet pavement outside a building that no longer wanted her, holding the one piece of her grandfather she had left, while rain fell steadily around her like the whole sky had decided to grieve alongside her. Inside the building, the aftermath continued without her. Robert spent the next hour reassuring the Harpers over coffee in his office, carefully framing the evening's events as an unfortunate but properly addressed incident. A negligent employee swiftly dismissed. A commitment to safety clearly demonstrated. The kind of story designed to soothe worried sponsors back into their original level of confidence. The Harpers listened politely, nodding at appropriate intervals, though something in their expressions remained carefully guarded. The particular caution of people who had heard a story a little too neatly resolved to be entirely comfortable with it. Derek retreated to the locker room, sitting alone on a bench for a long time, staring at nothing in particular. Somewhere beneath the practiced indifference he'd shown Wren at the front desk, a small, uncomfortable weight had settled into his chest. One he didn't yet have the vocabulary to name. He told himself repeatedly that it wasn't really his fault, that the floor probably had been a little slick, that Ellie probably should have practiced the technique more carefully before attempting it in front of an audience, that Wren ultimately was just a cleaning girl, replaceable, unimportant, not someone whose feelings needed to weigh on him this heavily. He almost believed it by the time he finally stood up and headed home. Almost. Walter returned from the hospital a little after 10, exhausted, relieved to report that Ellie's injury, while serious, a hairline fracture near her hip, was expected to heal with proper care and physical therapy. She'd been in good spirits, all things considered, cracking jokes with the nurses, even through obvious pain. He found Robert still in his office, finishing paperwork, and asked, almost as an afterthought, where Wren had gone. "I let her go," Robert said, not looking up from his desk. "The mat wasn't cleaned properly. That's what caused the fall." Walter went very still. "Wren cleans that mat every single night. I've watched her do it myself, thoroughly, every single time." "Well, apparently not thoroughly enough tonight," Robert said, a note of finality in his voice that suggested the conversation was already over as far as he was concerned. "Robert," Walter said, his voice low and careful, the way a man speaks when he's trying very hard not to say something he can't take back. "Do you have any idea who that young woman actually is?" Robert finally looked up, mild irritation flickering across his face. "She's a cleaning girl, Walter. I don't need her resume to know she left a wet spot on my mat." Walter opened his mouth, ready to tell him everything. The championship, the grandfather, the entire history stitched into a worn black belt that Robert had never once bothered to notice, despite it walking past him nearly every single night for 4 months. But something stopped him. A tired, aching certainty that the truth, delivered in anger, wouldn't land the way it needed to. Not tonight. Not with Robert this defensive, this focused on smoothing over sponsors rather than examining what had actually happened on his own training floor. "Never mind," Walter said instead. "I'll speak with you tomorrow once things have settled." He left the office and drove home slowly through the rain, his mind turning over everything he now knew, everything Robert refused to see, and the uncomfortable, growing certainty that this story was far from finished. Somewhere across town, in a small apartment with a water-stained ceiling, Wren Calloway sat on the edge of her bed, her grandfather's belt drying carefully across a towel on the floor, wondering if she had just lost the only steady thing left in her exhausted, uncertain life. Carol heard about the firing before midnight, the way small towns and small workplaces always seem to move news faster than any official announcement ever could. One of the evening students, a young man who'd witnessed part of the confrontation at the front desk, mentioned it to his mother, who happened to play cards on Thursdays with Carol's neighbor, who called Carol directly the moment she heard, certain Carol would want to know right away. Carol didn't wait for morning. She called Wren that same night, a little after 11, her voice tight with a mixture of concern and barely restrained anger.
"Honey, tell me that's not true," Carol said the moment Wren picked up. "Tell me Robert Whitfield did not actually fire you over a mat that man himself has never once bothered to inspect in the 4 years I've worked there."
Wren sat on the edge of her bed, the belt still drying on a towel across the room, and found to her own surprise that she didn't have the energy left to cry anymore that night. She'd used it all up kneeling in the rain outside the academy, gathering her scattered life off wet pavement. "It's true," she said. "Derek told his father the floor was slick. I don't think either of them even believed it. I think they just needed someone to blame quickly before those sponsors changed their minds about the money." Carol was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped into something colder, something Wren hadn't heard from her before. "That family has been getting away with things like this for years, small things mostly. Nothing anybody could ever quite prove, but this, honey, this is different. A woman is in the hospital and they blamed the one person in that building who actually does her job properly." "I don't know what to do about it," Wren admitted. "I need this job."
I needed this job.
"You let me worry about that part," Carol said, a note of steel entering her voice that surprised even her. "You just take care of yourself tonight. Get some rest if you can manage it. I've got a few calls of my own to make in the morning." Wren didn't ask what calls she meant. She was too tired that night to hold on to anything beyond simply getting through until sunrise. Ruth Owens received her own version of the news the following morning from Walter himself, who called her directly, uncertain who else he could trust with the full weight of what he now understood. He told her everything. The clipping, the championship, Samuel Calloway and the origins of open hands, the accident with Ellie, and the convenient, unproven story Robert and Derek had settled on to explain it away. Ruth listened in silence for most of the call, the particular silence of someone building a case in her mind, piece by piece, the way she'd built hundreds of cases over 26 years on the force. "You believe Derek pushed her too hard, don't you?" Ruth said, finally, once Walter finished. "Not an accident with the mat, an accident with his own carelessness." "I do," Walter said. "I was 30 feet away and I saw the whole demonstration before it happened. That boy grabbed her wrist like she was one of his sparring partners, not a 68-year-old woman 3 months into a beginner's class." "And nobody's said that out loud yet," Ruth said. "Not to Robert. Not to anyone who matters." "Not yet," Walter admitted. "I tried last night. He wasn't in any state to hear it." Ruth sat with that for a long moment, an old habit of hers, whenever a situation demanded more patience than instinct. Then she said slowly, "That building's got cameras in the main training room." "Has, since they renovated 2 years back. Insurance requirement, if I remember Robert complaining about the cost correctly." Walter went still on his end of the line. "You think there's footage of what actually happened?" "I know there's footage," Ruth said. "The question is whether anyone's bothered to look at it yet, or whether they're too busy deciding who to blame to check what actually occurred." "Robert's not going to hand that footage over easily," Walter said. "Not if it proves his son at fault right before a funding decision that could reshape the whole program." "Then we don't ask nicely the first time," Ruth said, something in her voice carrying the unshakable confidence of a woman who had spent decades getting truth out of rooms that didn't want to give it up. "Give me a few days, Walter. I still know people, and I don't much care for watching an innocent young woman get blamed for something she didn't do. Never have, never will." She hung up the phone, poured herself a second cup of coffee, and sat at her kitchen table for a long time thinking through exactly how a retired sergeant with old instincts and a handful of old contacts might go about setting a badly wronged story back onto its rightful footing. Wren spent the following days in a strange, suspended kind of grief, the sort that settles over a person after losing something they hadn't fully realized they valued until it was gone. She picked up extra shifts at a diner near campus, the kind of work that asked nothing of her except speed and a polite smile, work that never once made her feel seen, the way those evenings at the academy occasionally had. She kept the belt in her bag still, though. There seemed less reason now to carry it anywhere at all. She thought about Ellie often, wondering how the recovery was progressing, wishing she had a way to check in without it seeming strange, coming from someone who'd just been fired under circumstances everyone in that building surely understood didn't actually involve her. She thought about Walter, too, and the promise in his eyes the night he'd handed back that faded newspaper clipping. Your grandfather would not want you standing there with your hands hidden behind your back. She wondered some nights whether he'd been right, whether keeping her hands hidden for all these years had cost her more than it had ever actually protected. She had no way of guessing, walking home from her diner shifts through the same steady rain that seemed to follow every difficult season of her life, that somewhere across town, an old instructor, a recovering hospital patient, and a retired police sergeant with sharp eyes and sharper instincts had already begun building the case that would soon bring her back through that academy's front doors. Not as someone begging for her job back, but as someone the whole building was finally about to see clearly for exactly who she had always been. The diner kept her busy enough most mornings, though busy wasn't quite the same thing as steady. She worked the counter mostly, refilling coffee, running plates, listening to regulars talk about the weather and the high school football schedule and whatever local gossip had made the rounds that week. Nobody there asked about her past. Nobody there had any reason to. One elderly regular, a widower named Frank, who came in every morning at 7 for the same plate of eggs and toast, took a particular liking to her over those strange, suspended days. "You've got good hands," he told her one morning, watching her balance 3 plates without spilling a drop. "Steady? My wife used to say that's the whole trick to anything worth doing. Steady hands, patient heart." Wren smiled, refilling his coffee without being asked. "Sounds like she was a smart woman." "Smartest I ever met," Frank said, stirring his coffee slowly. "Married up, if you want the honest truth of it." She liked Frank's easy, undemanding company, the way he never asked for more from her than a full cup and a bit of conversation. It reminded her in small ways of Ellie, of Walter, of the quiet decency she'd started to associate with people who'd simply lived long enough to stop needing to prove anything to anybody. She thought more than once during that stretch of days that maybe this was enough. A diner counter, steady hands, a paycheck that came without the complications of a name stitched into old fabric. But some nights driving home past the darkened academy on her way to her apartment, she found herself slowing the car without meaning to, glancing at the building, the way a person glances at an old photograph they haven't quite decided to put away for good. She didn't know, most of those nights, that the building was glancing back in its own way too, that an old plaque sat forgotten in a storage closet waiting for someone to remember it existed, that a folder of security footage sat untouched on a server waiting for someone with the right kind of patience to ask the right kind of question. Some things wait a long time to be noticed. It rarely means they've stopped mattering in the meantime. Somewhere across town that same night, an old instructor sat at his kitchen table, long after the dishes were done, a phone in one hand and a decade-old newspaper clipping in the other, working out exactly how to make sure the waiting was almost over. He didn't know exactly how the next few days would unfold. He only knew with the quiet certainty of a man who had waited a long time for the right moment that he wasn't going to let this particular silence stretch on much longer. Some fights, he thought, folding the clipping closed for the night, are worth losing a little sleep over. This one, he had already decided, was going to be one of them, whatever it ended up costing him. Outside his kitchen window, the rain had finally slowed to a light, steady patter against the glass, the kind of quiet, patient rain that seems to know exactly how long a difficult season is supposed to last before it finally, gently begins to ease. A few days passed before anything moved. Wren spent them the way a person spends days after a small earthquake, cautious, unsteady, waiting for the ground to decide whether it was finished shifting. She picked up double shifts at the diner near campus. She studied for a biology exam at a corner booth between rushes, her textbook stained faintly with coffee rings. She did not call the academy. She did not expect the academy to call her. She thought more than once about simply letting the whole chapter close. Some doors, she told herself, are better left shut once they've swung open the wrong way. On the other side of town, 3 people who barely knew each other a month earlier had started working together with a kind of stubborn determination Wren herself would have recognized instantly had she been able to see it. The diner job kept her busy enough to avoid thinking too hard about the academy most hours of most days. It was steady work, if unremarkable. The kind of place where regulars ordered the same thing every morning and nobody asked much about a person's history beyond how they liked their coffee. She missed it more than she expected to. Not the mopping itself, and certainly not Derek's voice trailing her down the hallway most nights, but the stretches before opening, the smell of chalk dust and rubber mats that had once meant something warm to her before it meant something complicated instead. She missed Ellie's easy conversation most of all, the gentle way the older woman had of making Wren feel like more than the job she was paid to do. She thought about calling the hospital more than once, just to check in, just to hear that steady, unbothered voice again. She never quite worked up the nerve, telling herself it wasn't her place anymore, that she'd only complicate an already complicated situation by inserting herself into it further. She had no way of guessing how deeply Ellie had already pulled her into a case Ruth Owens had no intention of letting go unresolved. Ruth made her first call on a Tuesday morning to a man named Carl Bishop, who had spent 11 years installing security systems before retiring 2 towns over. Carl had installed the cameras at Whitfield Martial Arts Academy himself, back when Robert first renovated the training floor. "I don't need to break any laws here, Carl," Ruth said, sitting at her kitchen table with a legal pad in front of her, the old habit of an officer who liked things written down properly. "I just need to know how footage retrieval works on a system like that, whether an employee, say, could legally request to view footage involving themselves." Carl laughed, dry and knowing. "Depends on the state, depends on the system, but generally, yes. If someone's the subject of recorded footage, most systems like that one are required to let them view it on request, especially if there's a dispute about what happened. Whitfield's system logs everything to a cloud server, 90-day retention standard for a business that size." "And if the owner refuses to hand it over?" Ruth asked. "Then it starts looking a whole lot like he's got something to hide," Carl said, "which in my experience usually means he does." Ruth thanked him, hung up, and added a neat line to her legal pad. Then she called Walter. "She has every right to request that footage," Ruth told him that afternoon, the 2 of them sitting across from each other at a small diner not far from the academy. "She was the one accused. She was the one fired. Legally, she's entitled to see exactly what that camera caught." "Robert's not going to hand it over willingly," Walter said, stirring his coffee slowly.
Not if it shows what I think it shows.
"Then we don't ask him first," Ruth said. "We ask Ellie." Walter looked up. "Ellie? She's the one who got hurt," Ruth said. "She's the injured party. She has every right to request footage of her own accident for her own medical and legal records. Robert can stonewall an ex-employee. He's going to have a much harder time stonewalling a 68-year-old woman with a fractured hip and a very understandable interest in knowing exactly how it happened." Walter allowed himself for the first time in days a small, tired smile. "You'd have made a fine detective, Ruth." "I was a fine detective," Ruth said matter-of-fact. "For 26 years. Some skills don't retire just because the badge does." Ellie made the request from her hospital bed the following morning, her daughter helping her draft a short, formal letter while a physical therapist waited patiently in the hallway for their scheduled session. Robert received the letter with visible unease. He understood immediately the position it put him in. Refusing a clearly reasonable request from an injured woman, one whose family had already begun quietly asking pointed questions about liability, would look considerably worse than simply producing the footage and hoping it somehow supported the story he'd already told the Harpers. He watched the footage alone in his office late one evening after the building had emptied out. He watched it twice, then a third time, his stomach sinking further with each viewing. There was no slick spot on the mat. There was no evidence anywhere in the frame of anything Wren had failed to clean properly. What the footage showed clearly and undeniably was his son grabbing Ellie Post's wrist with far more force and speed than any technique she'd been taught, pushing forward into a release she'd never been drilled on, continuing that momentum even as her feet visibly struggled to keep pace.
It showed Ellie stumbling not from any wet floor but from being handled too roughly by someone who either hadn't noticed or hadn't cared that his training partner that evening was a beginner 3 months into her very first martial arts class. Robert sat alone in his office a long time after the third viewing, the glow of the monitor the only light in the room, understanding fully for perhaps the first time exactly what he had allowed to happen in order to protect a comfortable story. He didn't tell Derek right away. He needed first to decide what kind of man he actually wanted to be now that the convenient version of events had fallen apart in front of him. He thought about simply sending the footage to Ellie's family with a brief, careful apology, quietly reinstating Wren and hoping the whole matter faded before the invitational without further complication. He thought about that option for almost an entire day, but something kept nagging at him underneath the calculation, something that felt uncomfortably like the memory of a 10-year-old boy trailing behind his own father through an old converted warehouse, watching a man named Samuel Calloway teach a handful of strangers with nothing but patience and an old set of donated mats. He wasn't entirely sure whether that memory belonged to guilt or to something closer to shame. Either way, it refused to let him settle for the easy option. He found Derek that same night sitting alone in the empty locker room, still in his training clothes, staring at his own reflection in the small mirror above the sink, as though he didn't entirely recognize what looked back at him. "I watched the footage," Robert said, standing in the doorway. Derek didn't turn around right away. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that I owe 2 people a serious apology," Robert said. "And bad enough that I need to understand something from you honestly before I decide what happens next." Derek finally met his father's eyes in the mirror's reflection. "What do you need to understand?" "Why you lied," Robert said simply. "Not the technique, not the accident itself. I can accept a mistake made in the moment, pushing someone harder than you should have. What I can't accept is watching you let another person take the blame for it without a single word of correction while I stood right there and fired her." Derek was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working silently before the words finally came. "Because it was easier," he admitted. "Because she never fought back. Because I figured nobody would believe her over me anyway, so what difference did it make?" "And now?" Robert asked. "Now I know exactly how wrong I was about what she could and couldn't do." Derek said something raw, entering his voice for the first time in longer than his father could remember. "About all of it?" "I don't know how to fix that." Robert crossed the room and sat down heavily on the bench beside his son, the two of them staring at the same mirror, seeing perhaps for the first time in years something closer to the same reflection. "You start," Robert said, "by telling the truth tomorrow night in front of everyone, not because it's easy, because it's finally time." Walter found Robert there the next morning, staring at nothing in particular, a cold cup of coffee forgotten on the desk beside him. "I already know what you're going to tell me," Robert said before Walter could speak. "I watched the footage 3 times last night." Walter sat down slowly across from him. "And I fired the wrong person," Robert said, "and I let my son lie to my face while I did it. And I have 1 day before the biggest event of this academy's year and 2 sponsors who are already reconsidering their commitment based on a story that turns out to be completely false." Walter said nothing for a moment, giving the admission room to breathe. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the same faded newspaper clipping he had carried for weeks now. "There's something else you should know, Robert," Walter said. "Something considerably larger than one accident, one lie, or one bad decision made under pressure." He slid the clipping across the desk. Robert stared at the photograph a long moment. The young girl, mid-stance, fierce and focused, the headline above her fading but legible. "That's Wren," he said slowly. "That's Wren," Walter confirmed. "National junior champion over a decade ago. Trained from childhood by a man named Samuel Calloway." Robert's eyes lifted slowly from the clipping. "Samuel Calloway. Why does that name—" "Because he built this program," Walter said,
his voice steady, carrying decades of patience behind it. Open hands. Every part of it. Before your father sold the old warehouse, before the sponsors, before the trophy case out front, Samuel Calloway walked into this business with an idea scribbled on a grocery receipt and 6 students who could never have afforded a fee. He built the very thing you've been showing off to sponsors for years, Robert. And his granddaughter has been mopping your floors for 4 months, mostly unnoticed, while your son mocked her for it nearly every single night. Robert set the clipping down carefully as though it had grown suddenly heavy in his hands. "I didn't know," he said. "You didn't ask," Walter said, not unkindly but firmly enough that the words landed with their full weight. "None of us did, at first. That's rather the point of who she is, Robert. She never asked to be noticed for it. She just wanted a paycheck and a quiet place to finish out her degree without her past following her into every room she walked into." Robert sat with that a long time, the office silent except for the distant hum of the building's heating system kicking on somewhere overhead. "What do you think I should do?" he finally asked, and there was something almost boyish in the question, something that reminded Walter briefly of the child who used to trail his father through an old warehouse, watching a good man teach with an open heart. "I think," Walter said slowly, "that you have one night left to decide whether this academy still stands for anything your grandfather's era believed in, or whether it's simply become a business that happens to teach kicks and punches for a fee." The community meeting was scheduled for that same evening, called officially to address safety concerns raised by Ellie's accident, though word had already spread that something larger was coming. The room filled up faster than Robert expected. Students, parents, longtime members of the Open Hands program, even a few local business owners who sponsored various academy events over the years, all gathered in the same main training room where the accident had happened just days before. The Harpers sat near the front, their expressions carefully neutral, clearly still weighing whatever decision the evening's events might push them toward. Ellie arrived in a wheelchair, her daughter pushing her carefully through the side door, a soft blanket draped over her lap despite the mild evening outside. A few students rushed to help her find a spot near the front, and she settled in with the calm, unhurried dignity of a woman who had survived considerably worse than a fractured hip. Wren was not there. Nobody had told her about the meeting. Nobody, at that point, had thought to. Robert stood at the front of the room, Derek beside him, both of them visibly uncomfortable under the weight of so many watching eyes. "Thank you all for coming," Robert began, his voice steadier than he felt. "There's been some confusion about the circumstances of Eleanor Post's accident last week. I'd like to correct that record tonight." A murmur passed through the room, quiet but immediate. "The accident was not caused by improperly cleaned equipment," Robert continued, forcing the words out with visible effort. "I made that claim without confirming it first, and I was wrong to do so. I've since reviewed the security footage from that evening." He paused, glancing briefly at Derek, whose jaw stayed tight beside him. "The footage shows that my son applied a technique to Mrs. Post with more force and speed than she had been trained to handle. That is what caused her fall. Not the mat. Not the cleaning staff." The room went very still. Ellie spoke first, her voice carrying clearly despite its softness. "And the young woman you fired that same night, Wren, where does she stand in all of this?" "I fired her without proper investigation," Robert admitted, the words clearly costing him something significant to say aloud. "Based on an assumption that turned out to be false. I owe her a formal apology, and I intend to offer her both her position back and full back pay for the time she's been out of work." Walter stepped forward, then sensing the moment had arrived for the rest of the story to surface. "There's something more you should all know about her," he said, addressing the room now rather than Robert alone. "Something I only recently discovered myself, though I suspect a few of you have your own memories of this program's early years." He held up the faded clipping, angling it so the front rows could see the photograph clearly. "This is Wren Calloway," Walter said, "National Junior Martial Arts Champion more than a decade ago, and her grandfather, Samuel Calloway, is the man who founded Open Hands, this very program, The one this entire building has built its reputation and its funding on for years. A murmur rippled through the crowd, several older members nodding slowly, recognition dawning across faces that clearly remembered the name from decades past. "She's been cleaning these floors for 4 months," Walter continued, "mostly ignored, occasionally mocked, without a single person in this building bothering to ask who she really was or what she carried with her every single night in an old canvas bag." Ellie's hand rose to her mouth, tears gathering quickly.
"That sweet girl. That sweet, quiet girl saved my life from a falling shelf and none of us even knew."
Derek stood frozen through most of this, his face pale, his usual easy confidence entirely drained away. When he finally spoke, his voice came out smaller than anyone in that room had ever heard from him before.
"I didn't know either. I just thought she was." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. The word he might have used, weak, small, replaceable, suddenly unbearable to say aloud in a room full of people who now understood exactly how wrong that assessment had always been. "You thought she was beneath you?" Ellie said, her voice gentle but unmistakably firm, the tone of a woman who had spent decades teaching children before this and had no patience left for grown men avoiding accountability. "That's what you thought, isn't it, young man? And you were so certain of it, you never once considered you might be wrong." Derek's throat worked silently for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, that's what I thought." The honesty of it, unpracticed and unguarded for perhaps the first time in his life, seemed to surprise even him. Robert placed a hand on his son's shoulder, the gesture carrying less comfort than accountability. "We're going to make this right," he said to the room, to Ellie, to the memory of a man neither Derek nor most of the younger members present had ever actually met. "Starting tonight." Wren learned about the meeting the following morning, when Carol called her before her shift at the diner even started, her voice bright with an excitement Wren hadn't heard from her in weeks. "You need to come to the academy," Carol said. "Today, if you can manage it, before the tournament tonight."
"Carol, I don't work there anymore," Wren said, confused, still half asleep. "That," Carol said, "is about to change. Just trust me. Come see for yourself." Wren arrived a little after noon, uncertain what to expect, her stomach tight with a nervousness she couldn't quite name. She found Walter waiting for her near the front entrance, along with Robert, whose expression carried none of the hard, dismissive edge from the night he'd fired her. "Wren," Robert said before she could speak, "I owe you an apology. A significant one." He told her everything, the footage, the meeting the night before, the room full of people who now understood exactly who she was and exactly what her family had built inside these walls decades before Robert's own name ever went up on the sign out front. Wren listened in silence, her hands trembling slightly. The same trembling she remembered from the night she'd knelt in the rain gathering her grandfather's belt off wet pavement. "I want to offer you your position back," Robert continued, "with full back pay. And I want you to know that whatever you decide, this academy owes your family a debt we've been ignoring for far too long." Wren looked past him toward the trophy case near the far wall, the same one Derek had stood proudly in front of so many times over the past 4 months. "What about tonight?" she said. "The invitational. What happens with Derek?" Robert hesitated. "Derek's been informed he can't compete in the advanced division. Not after what came out last night. But there's still the exhibition match scheduled at the end of the evening, the friendly demonstration meant to showcase the program for the sponsors. We're not entirely sure how to handle it now." Walter stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "I have an idea about that, but it depends entirely on Wren." He turned to her directly. "The Harpers are still deciding whether to renew funding for Open Hands. Ellie's accident shook their confidence badly, and rightly so. If this program folds, dozens of people like Ellie lose the only affordable place in this town to build back a little strength, a little confidence in the years they have left." Wren felt the weight of that settle over her slowly. "What are you asking me to do?" she said. "I'm asking," Walter said, "whether you'd be willing to step onto that mat tonight.
Not for revenge, not to humiliate anyone the way you were humiliated, but to show every person in that audience, sponsors included, exactly what your grandfather's program was always meant to produce. Discipline, skill, strength used the right way for the right reasons. Wren was quiet a long moment, her eyes drifting again toward the trophy case, toward the empty space beside it where a small plaque with founders' names had once hung, removed years ago during a renovation nobody had ever bothered to correct.
"And Derek," she said finally. "What does he get out of tonight?"
"A chance," Walter said simply, "to learn the one lesson his father never quite managed to teach him. That strength without humility eventually meets something it can't outrun." Wren nodded slowly, something settling into place behind her eyes, calm and steady. The same expression Walter had first noticed the night she'd knelt to gather a scattered belt off a countertop months ago now, though it felt like considerably longer.
"All right," she said. "I'll fight him. But on my terms. No trophies, no score. Just enough for everyone in that room to finally see clearly."
Word moved through the small community faster than anyone official had planned for it to. Carol heard a version of it from a neighbor before lunch and called Wren immediately, breathless with an excitement she hadn't allowed herself in weeks. Ruth heard it directly from Walter, calm and measured, already thinking 3 steps ahead about what the evening might require of everyone involved. By early afternoon, a handful of longtime Open Hands members had heard enough of the story secondhand to start arriving at the academy early, curious, hopeful, unwilling to miss whatever was about to happen in that building before the day was through. Wren spent the hours before the exhibition in the small office at the back of the building, alone with her thoughts for the first time all day. She thought about her grandfather, about the garage with the space heater that never quite worked, about 100 small mornings of discipline that had led somehow to this one particular evening. She thought too about the promise she'd made herself in a hospital waiting room years ago.
"Not unless I truly have no other choice."
She turned the words over slowly, testing them against everything that had happened since. A woman in a wheelchair who deserved better than a lie told to protect a comfortable story. A program that had quietly kept its doors open to people the world had stopped noticing. A grandfather's name waiting patiently in a storage closet to be hung back up where it belonged. She decided sitting there in the quiet that this counted. This was exactly the kind of choice her grandfather would have recognized as one worth making. Word of the exhibition spread through the building within hours, and by the time evening arrived, the main training room had filled well beyond its usual capacity for the Invitational's closing demonstration. Ellie sat near the front again, her wheelchair positioned carefully to give her a clear view of the mat, her daughter beside her. A soft, proud smile already forming despite the nervous energy radiating through the crowd. The Harpers sat a few rows back, their expressions harder to read than before, though clearly curious about whatever this unusual, hastily arranged exhibition might reveal. Carol stood near the entrance, arms crossed, practically vibrating with anticipation. Ruth sat toward the middle of the room, her posture straight and alert, the posture of a woman who had waited a long time to see a wrong finally corrected. Wren changed into a spare uniform in the small office at the back of the building, the same office where Walter had first shown her that faded clipping weeks earlier. She pulled her hair back into a tight braid, the same style she'd worn as a 15-year-old girl standing on a podium a lifetime ago. She reached into her bag, the torn seam still held together with careful stitches Carol had helped her repair earlier that week, and pulled out the folded black belt at the bottom. She held it a long moment, running her thumb over the faded gold letters spelling out her grandfather's name.
"I hope this is what you meant," she whispered, "about not hiding my hands anymore."
She tied the belt around her waist over her uniform, the fabric worn soft from years of handling but still somehow carrying every bit of the weight it had always held. Derek was already on the mat when she walked out, his expression a mixture of nervousness and something closer to genuine humility than anyone in that room had ever seen from him before. Robert stood near the edge of the mat to address the crowd. "Tonight's exhibition isn't about winning or losing," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "It's about honoring what this academy was always meant to stand for: discipline,
respect, and the understanding that true strength is never about who you can make feel small. He gestured toward Wren as she stepped fully onto the mat, and a wave of warm applause moved through the crowd, entirely unlike the mocking laughter that had once followed her across that very same floor. Wren bowed to Derek, first formal and precise, the gesture Walter had taught generations of students before either of them had been born. Derek returned the bow, his movements stiff with visible nerves. "You don't have to do this if you don't want to," Wren said, only for him to hear. "I'm not interested in embarrassing you the way you embarrassed me." Derek looked up at her, something raw and unguarded crossing his face. "I think I need to do this," he said. "I think I need to understand exactly what I got wrong about you. About all of it." The match began slowly, both of them circling with careful, measured steps, the room holding its collective breath. Derek moved first, a strong, confident strike aimed at testing her guard. Wren redirected it easily, her movement so economical it barely seemed to cost her any effort at all, sending Derek stumbling slightly forward before he caught his balance. The crowd murmured, several students leaning forward in their seats. Derek tried again, faster this time, a combination he'd drilled hundreds of times against sparring partners half as skilled as the woman now standing across from him. Wren absorbed the first strike, redirected the second, and used his own forward momentum to guide him gently, almost delicately, down onto the mat. She didn't press the advantage. She simply stepped back, offering him room to rise. He stood slowly, breathing harder now, something shifting visibly in his expression. The dawning, uncomfortable understanding of a young man realizing for the first time in his life that he was facing someone operating on an entirely different level than anyone he'd ever trained against. "Again," he said, his voice tight but determined. They continued for several more exchanges, and with each one the room grew quieter, more attentive, watching Wren move with a precision and calm control that made clear, beyond any argument, exactly how many years of discipline lived inside her small, unassuming frame. She never struck harder than necessary. She never held a position longer than needed to make her point. Every single motion carried the same restraint Walter had first noticed months earlier, the restraint of someone who had learned the hard way exactly how much damage unchecked strength could cause, and had spent years since making absolutely certain she never repeated that mistake. The final exchange came almost gently by comparison. Derek threw one last strike, exhausted now more out of stubborn pride than any real hope of success. Wren caught his wrist, redirected his momentum with barely any visible effort, and guided him down onto the mat a final time, holding a light, controlled pin for exactly as long as it took the room to understand the match was over. Then she released him immediately, stepping back, offering her hand to help him rise. Derek stared at her hand a long moment before taking it, allowing her to pull him back to his feet. "I'm sorry," he said, only for her and Walter standing close by to hear clearly. "For all of it. The teasing, the lie about the mat, all of it." Wren studied him for a moment, searching his face for whatever remained of the arrogance that had defined him for months. She found less of it than she expected. "I know," she said simply. "I could see at the moment your father told the truth last night. Some people need to lose something before they understand what they actually had." The room broke into applause, warm and sustained, entirely different from the polite golf claps of the earlier demonstration. Ellie was crying openly now, her daughter's hand resting gently on her shoulder. Carol wiped at her own eyes near the doorway, muttering something about dust that fooled absolutely no one nearby. Robert stepped forward once the applause settled, his voice thick with an emotion he clearly hadn't expected to feel that evening. "Derek will be stepping back from competitive events for a while," he announced to the room. "He'll be assisting with the Open Hands program instead, under Walter's direct supervision, starting this week." Derek nodded, accepting the consequence without argument, something in his posture already looking lighter than it had in months, the particular relief of a person finally set down a weight they hadn't realized they were carrying. "And as for funding," Robert continued, turning toward the Harpers, "I understand if tonight hasn't fully restored your confidence, but I want to commit personally to a 5-year renewal of Open Hands funding, regardless of your decision, even if it means covering the difference from this academy's own budget." Mr. Harper stood slowly, glancing at his wife before speaking.
"We came here tonight prepared to walk away," he admitted. "What we saw instead was a young woman handle an injustice with more grace than most people manage in a lifetime, and an owner willing to publicly admit exactly where he went wrong." He turned toward Wren. "We'd like to fund a permanent instructor position for you within this program, if you're interested. Paid, of course, properly this time." A soft murmur of approval moved through the crowd. Walter stepped forward once more, holding something small in his weathered hands, a wooden plaque, freshly polished, though the engraving on it clearly wasn't new. "This used to hang beside the trophy case," he said, addressing the room. "Years ago, before a renovation took it down and nobody ever put it back up. I found it in storage 3 days ago, buried under boxes nobody's opened in over a decade." He held it up for the room to see. "Founders," it read simply, followed by a short list of names, Samuel Calloway's among them, the letters slightly faded but still perfectly legible. "I think it's time this went back where it belongs," Walter said. He crossed the room slowly and mounted the plaque himself right beside the trophy case, his hands steady despite his age, despite the years since he'd last performed this particular task. Wren watched from across the room, her hand rising unconsciously to rest against her chest, against the belt she still wore over her uniform, feeling something settle inside her that she hadn't realized had been unsettled for years. Ellie asked to be wheeled closer once the plaque was mounted, her daughter guiding the chair carefully across the mat. "Your grandfather," she said, looking up at Wren with tears still bright in her eyes, "would be so proud of you tonight. Not just for the match, for everything. For carrying all of this for so long without ever once asking anyone to notice." Wren knelt beside the wheelchair, taking Ellie's hand gently in both of hers. "You don't need to thank me," she said softly. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Ellie said firmly, shaking her head. "Not anyone. You. And I intend to keep thanking you for exactly as long as I'm still around to do it." The room had grown quiet again, watching the exchange with the particular stillness that settles over a crowd, witnessing something they understand instinctively is worth remembering. Wren reached into her bag one last time, pulling out the same worn canvas fabric, the seam still visibly repaired along the bottom, and set it gently on a small table near the trophy case, right beside the freshly mounted plaque bearing her grandfather's name. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't need to. Everyone in that room understood without being told exactly what it represented. The building emptied out slowly that night, students lingering longer than usual, reluctant to let the evening end. Carol hugged Wren twice on her way out the second time, simply because the first hadn't felt like enough. Ruth paused near the doorway, offering Wren a firm, respectful nod, the particular gesture of one professional acknowledging another. "You handled that better than most people I worked alongside for 26 years, she said. "That's not a small compliment." Wren smiled, tired but genuinely at peace for the first time in longer than she could easily remember. "Thank you for everything you did behind the scenes. I didn't even know you were fighting for me until today. Some of the best work happens before anybody even realizes it needs doing," Ruth said. Walter was the last to leave, standing near the trophy case a long moment, studying the newly mounted plaque and the worn canvas bag resting beside it. "Your grandfather started something here that outlasted every single renovation this building's gone through," he said, as Wren joined him near the case. "I have a feeling watching you tonight that it's going to keep outlasting a great many things still to come." Wren looked at the plaque, then at the bag, then finally out toward the empty mat where just an hour earlier an old injustice had finally been set right. "I think," she said, "he'd just be glad I finally stopped hiding." Walter nodded, patted her shoulder once, and switched off the lights on his way out, leaving the trophy case glowing softly under its small overhead light. A founder's name and a worn canvas bag sitting together exactly where they had always belonged. Outside, the rain had finally stopped.
For the first time in weeks, the night sky over the parking lot had cleared completely, revealing a wide stretch of stars scattered plainly overhead. The kind of clear night that seems, every so often, to arrive precisely when it's needed most. Wren stood beside her car a long moment before climbing in, looking back at the darkened building behind her, thinking of her grandfather, her grandmother, and every patient lesson they had ever tried to teach her about strength, dignity, and the particular courage it takes to finally let yourself be seen. Somewhere, she liked to think, they were both glad to see it too.
3 weeks later, the Academy's evening schedule looked different than it had all year. Wren taught the Tuesday and Thursday self-defense class now, alongside Walter, splitting the instruction between them in a rhythm that seemed to come naturally to both of them, as though they'd been doing it for years rather than weeks. Her college schedule still filled her mornings and afternoons, but the evenings had become something she genuinely looked forward to again, rather than something she simply endured for a paycheck. Ellie returned to class in early autumn, moving carefully with the aid of a cane at first, though she waved it off dismissively any time someone offered to help her too eagerly. "I fell down once," she liked to say. "I don't intend on making a habit of staying down." She sat near the front most evenings, occasionally joining in on the gentler drills, more often simply watching, offering encouragement to newer students the way a person offers something they know firsthand to be genuinely valuable. Derek stayed on with the program too, exactly as his father had promised. He arrived early most days now, setting up mats without being asked, staying late to help newer students who struggled with techniques he'd once shown off carelessly in front of sponsors. He was quieter these days, less inclined to fill a room the moment he entered it. A few of the older open-hand students, the ones who remembered exactly what he used to be like, said the change suited him considerably better. He and Wren rarely spoke beyond what the work required, though. Something had settled between them that neither of them felt any particular need to name. Not friendship exactly. Something closer to a quiet mutual understanding between two people who had both, in their own separate ways, learned something difficult about themselves in the same short stretch of time. The founder's plaque stayed mounted beside the trophy case, polished now and dusted regularly. Samuel Calloway's name catching the overhead light every evening students filed past it on their way to the mats. The worn canvas bag stayed beside it too, tucked carefully into a small glass display Robert had commissioned specifically for the purpose. A brief printed card beside it, explaining simply that it had once belonged to the man who started everything the Academy now stood for. New students occasionally asked about it, curious about the strange, humble object sitting so prominently beside gleaming trophies and framed championship photographs. The answer they usually received from whichever instructor happened to be nearby was some version of the same simple truth. It belonged to someone who never needed anyone to notice him in order to keep doing the right thing anyway. His granddaughter learned that lesson from him early, and it took the rest of us considerably longer to learn it from her. On a quiet Thursday evening in late autumn, after the last student had left and the building had settled into its familiar after-hours silence, Wren found herself alone on the main mat, running through a slow, deliberate set of forms her grandfather had taught her more than a decade earlier. She moved through them carefully, each motion precise, unhurried, the same calm control that had once carried her across a championship mat and later across this very room, closing a door that had needed closing for far too long. Walter watched from the doorway a while before finally speaking. "You know," he said, "your grandfather used to close out every evening exactly the same way. Same forms, same slow pace, right at closing time when the room had finally gone quiet enough to hear yourself think." Wren finished the final movement and let her arms settle naturally at her sides, her breathing steady, calm. "I remember," she said. "I used to sit right over there and watch him do it. I didn't understand back then why he always saved it for the very end of the night instead of the beginning." "Any idea now?" Walter asked. Wren considered the question a long moment, looking around the room, the trophy case glowing softly under its small light, a grandfather's name resting peacefully beside a worn canvas bag that no longer needed to stay hidden at the bottom of anything. "I think," she said finally, "he wanted to end every single day certain of exactly who he was." Not for anyone watching, just for himself.
Walter smiled, the tired, satisfied smile of an old man who had spent 30 years waiting to see a good thing properly returned to where it belonged. "Your grandfather would be very proud of you," he said. "Not for the tournament and not for winning that match. For every quiet night before it when nobody was watching, and you still chose to do the right thing anyway." Wren looked toward the front windows where the evening had settled into a calm, clear darkness outside, the kind that follows a long stretch of difficult weather once it has finally fully passed. "That's the part I intend to keep teaching," she said, "for as long as anyone still needs reminding of it." She switched off the lights a few minutes later, locked the front door behind her, and walked out into the cool autumn air, carrying nothing hidden, nothing folded away at the bottom of a bag, nothing left to prove to anyone who might still be watching. Just herself, finally exactly as she was. Somewhere in a quiet way that had nothing to do with trophies or applause, that had always been the whole point of everything her grandfather built. Not a championship. Not a single dramatic evening, just the steady, patient work of becoming someone worth being one ordinary night at a time, whether anyone happened to be watching or not. That, more than any medal or any belt folded at the bottom of an old canvas bag, was the inheritance he had actually left her to carry forward. And it was, she suspected, exactly the kind of inheritance he would have wanted passed along quietly to whoever needed it next, long after her own name had faded gently on some future plaque of its own, hanging somewhere she couldn't yet quite imagine, in a building not even built yet.